Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to Fatima Bhutto for coming after, I think, a rather grueling list of these things, and she has a bit of flu.
As do you.
But is very admirably turned up anyway. And there are lots of copies of the book here, which I don't know how many of you have read, but if you have, you'll see on the cover, and I don't know whether, quite interested to know whether this was your idea or the publisher's idea, but it says on the top of the cover there, granddaughter of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, niece of Benazir Bhutto, daughter of Mir Murtaza Bhutto, and niece of Shah Nawaz Bhutto. So very much placing you in the dynasty.
Very South Asian, isn't it?
And I don't know, and of course all four of these people were, depending how you look at it, assassinated, murdered, executed. So was that your idea, or do you think it's a good plan?
No, it wasn't my idea. I think people imagine that authors have great control over their covers, but no, it wasn't my idea, and I did find it shocking. I did find it strange to look at. And I suppose for several reasons. It is, you know, I joke about it being South Asian. But you are always someone's daughter or someone's something else, and I'm sort of introduced, like being a niece is my professional title. So that, you know, that is strange to do. But I do think that it should be shocking, and it is shocking. And because we now accept that a certain level of violence is part of how certain countries do politics, especially when it comes to Pakistan, you know, we had these, you know, elections, and I always say we call them selections in Pakistan, in 2008. And I remember speaking to a journalist afterwards saying, oh, well, they were very peaceful elections. And I said, well, no, they weren't. 25 people were killed. And they said, well, that's great for Pakistan. You know, and if 25 people were killed now on May 6th, it would cause outrage. But that violence is not only tolerated, but I think it's expected. So I think the fact that it not only has people's names up and these relatives' names, but says killed in, assassinated in, murdered in, it should be shocking, because it should be the exception, not the norm. And in Pakistan, unfortunately, an assassination is the norm.
You're not in politics, at least not yet, and you are writing. Why don't you tell people what you're doing?
Yes, well, I spent the last 6 years really working on Songs of Blood and Sword. I wrote a column for the Jang newspaper in Pakistan. I write for the New Statesman and Daily Beast and other publications. And, you know, I was being not superstitious and sort of telling everybody that, oh no, I've already started working on the next project, and which I hope will be a book about Karachi. So in my mind, at least, it's writing that I move forward with, and nothing else. But of course, it is political writing, and I am a political person. But no, I have no interest in running for anything.
Yes.
Or in running. I don't like running either, actually.
Okay. So. Right. Now then, I think what we should do is explain the basic story which is behind your book, which is that your father, I mean, virtually every aspect of this is contested, but there is no contesting the fact he was murdered outside of your house when you were how old?
14.
14 years old, and you were in the home at the time. So can you just tell people what happened that night?
Yes. Well, I will say, I mean, you know, I've been heavily criticized for criticizing my grandfather. I've been criticized for defending my father. But the one thing that has not been contested about this book is nobody has said to me, oh, well, all that stuff you said about the corruption is wrong. Nobody said, all that stuff you mentioned about the murder cases, well, that's wrong. And what happened that night, and the way that violence is carried out in Pakistan, doesn't leave, in my opinion at least, a lot of room for doubt. So in 1996, my father... Sorry, can you hear me all right? Because I feel like my head's in a bowl. I can't hear me. Great, okay. In 1996, my father was an elected member of parliament in Pakistan, and he was a very vocal critic, not only of his sisters and her husband, corruption...
Which is Benazir Bhutto and Asif Zardari, the current president.
Right. but also of the human rights abuses happening under their second regime, notably Operation Cleanup, and very vocal about the compromises that Benazir had made as the then lifetime chairperson of the Pakistan People's Party. And he was returning to our home after a public meeting in the suburbs of Karachi that night. And as he turned onto Clifton Road, and for those of you who maybe know Karachi, you know, Clifton is quite, you know, it's called leafy, it's called spacious, but it's a neighborhood where across from us is the British High Commission, the Italians have their embassy there, the Iranians, the Russian. And the street lights had been shut on Clifton Road. There were 70 to 100 policemen, some of them in sniper positions in the trees. And they had been surrounded, my father and those traveling with him. And that night, 7 men were murdered. 3 of the men were killed with single sniper shots to the head or the heart. 2 of the men were injured, but not fatally, and died of their injuries in police custody. And 2 men, my father and Ashik Jatoi, were shot several times, but died due to point-blank execution shots. My father to his jaw and Ashik Jatoi to the back of his head. Immediately after, the men were left to bleed on the roads for anywhere between half an hour to 45 minutes, after which they were all taken, as was the MO under Operation Cleanup at the time, to different locations, none of them to emergency hospitals, some to clinics, some to dispensaries, but not to the 2 hospitals in Karachi that are known to be the only facilities that take police cases. The streets were cleaned up, and the rest, as they say, is history. And
you, I mean, you know, you were old enough to be very aware of what had happened.
Well, you know, Karachi at that time was going through, I mean, I've never seen my city in the throes of such violence since. And at the time, Operation Cleanup was this very genocidally named operation that my aunt's government had empowered the police and the security forces through to, quote, clean up Karachi. And clean up Karachi initially meant targeting members of the ethnic Muhajir party, the MQM, who had broken Benazir's first government, who were, you know, causing serious threats to her second, and who were at the time, you know, a quasi sort of ethno-fascist party. But surely, if that was the case, they should have been arrested and taken to trial. But instead, the police were empowered to stage these extrajudicial murders, which we called encounters. You know, like how you have an encounter at a coffee shop when you run into a friend, or at a library when you meet an old professor. And the language of how we spoke of our violence at the time was in this manner. Extrajudicial murders become police encounters, where the police turn up in an area to arrest so-and-so terrorists. And of course, everyone was a terrorist at that point. Whether they were community activists, muhajirs, members of the MQM, members of alternate parties. And the police would claim to be there to arrest the offensive terrorist. The offensive terrorist would try to run away and evade arrest, and so they had to be shot in the head several times.
Yeah, I mean, this was a very brutal period in Karachi, but I guess the question...
So the question is that that's what we lived in. So when we heard gunfire, it wasn't abnormal. When we were going to school, we heard gunfire. My school was shot at several times. We heard gunfire in our homes when we went to friends' houses. And it became part of the symphony of Karachi at that time. So when we heard the shooting that night, only 2 things were different about it. One, it was sustained. It wasn't the typical burst you hear and then it moves away. And the second was that it was incredibly close to us. It was as if it was being, all the bullets were being fired over our heads. But even at that time, there was a large part of us that felt, oh, well, this is Karachi. Who wouldn't have guessed?
Now, the difficult, I mean, that's uncontested. The difficult bit is who ordered this.
Yes.
And why, I mean, rather than you quote you the words in your book, why don't you describe what you believe was the role of Benazir Bhutto and Asif Zardari in this event?
So I've said this multiple times, but I'll repeat it. I think that there is certainly a moral responsibility, and as the Prime Minister of a country, a Prime Minister who not only...
just to emphasise, she was Prime Minister at the time.
Yes, she was Prime Minister at the time. She was an elected Prime Minister at the time. Benazir Bhutto presided over...